What's up, guys? Today I'm going to do a video that I'm going to call the Civil Rights Movement Part 1. Kind of just talking about the late 40s into the mid to late 50s. Obviously, we know that later on in the 1960s, you're going to see more and more civil rights efforts and victories go through. But today we're going to kind of look at the era in which you can't necessarily say that people started fighting for civil rights because they've always fought for civil rights. But I think it was John Green that said that this is the time period that the movement starts winning and starts changing. So that's what we're going to look at today. So one thing that historians have often argued about or discussed is what specific event set the civil rights movement into motion. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act as if I know the exact one or if there is even an exact one. But we're going to start in 1948 with something that I mentioned earlier, that Harry Truman, the president of the United States, decides to desegregate the military. Okay, the idea that not any soldier, white, black, Asian, Latino, whatever it is, should be separated in different battalions or platoons or whatever. Everyone will serve together. Now, this is a big move by Harry Truman, and it served to be really unpopular, especially with a lot of his following in the South and Southern Democrats. In the South, as you'll see as we move throughout this video, the idea of Jim Crow laws and segregation are much, much more a part of life than what you'll see here in the North. So one of the other important things that really moved the civil rights movement in the right direction is going to be a court case. Now, I need you to write this down because it's one of the most important court cases in our history. It's called Brown versus Board of Education, or Brown versus Board for short. That happened in 1954. And what it argued was the idea that African American children or minority children of any race should be allowed to attend any school that they please. There should not be separate schools for white children and African American children. At this point in time, the law was still following this other court case in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson. And what the Supreme Court had decided in 1896 was that as long as things or places are of equal quality, they can remain segregated. Okay, so this applies to trains, this applies to schools, to movie theaters, whatever. Basically, up until 1954, what the law said was as long as that they are of equal quality, that the African American train car is of equal quality as the white train car, that you could remain segregated. Well, here's the problem. Do you think that it ever was equal? No, they were separate and unequal. Okay, and in 1954, Thurgood Marshall will argue the case for the African American and minority families, and they will overturn that separate but equal law, saying that it is unconstitutional to do so. And really, that's what it did, was end that. But at the same time, it also was supposed to desegregate schools, which moving forward, you'll see that that's not going to necessarily take place right away in 1954. Later on, we'll probably talk a little bit about the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, and some stuff that goes on in colleges in the United States as well. Shortly after the Brown versus Board of Education case, we're going to see another very historical event progressing the civil rights movement. And this comes by the hand of a 14-year-old boy. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about a kid by the name of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was an African American from Chicago. He was about 14 years old. He decided to spend one summer down in Mississippi with his cousin and his uncle, working on the fields and just doing something a little bit different for the summer. His mom had warned him about what it was like in the South and that he had to be careful because he was an outspoken, energetic 14-year-old. And he wasn't worried about it at all. But when they got down to Mississippi, things would change. Long story short, what happens is that Emmett goes into a convenience store, if you will, and supposedly had made some remarks or whistled at a young white store owner or clerk. Um, didn't seem like a huge deal to the boys at the time, but later that evening or that night, in the middle of the night, actually, her husband and his brother-in-law, would show up. Okay, they would show up at the house. They would drag Emmett out of the house, back to outbuilding outside of one of their properties, um, beat him nearly to death. They would then shoot him in the head, and then tie a cotton gin fan around his neck with barbed wire, and then they disposed of his body in the Tallahatchie River. A couple of days later, his corpse is found, and obviously they're going to try to solve this murder. Um, the two guys that had kidnapped him were put on trial in Sumner, Mississippi. They had an entire jury that was locals who were all white. Um, and basically, even though they had said that they had kidnapped him, they denied murdering him. Um, they both were acquitted, meaning that they both were let free when the evidence was overwhelming that they had kidnapped and murdered this kid for basically nothing. Um, Emmett's mother decided at his funeral that she would have an open casket funeral, meaning that you could come view the deceased body. Now, Emmett's body was in a river for several days. He was beaten horribly. So his body was very, very deformed. It was eaten away. You did not resemble the Emmett that everybody knew. But thousands and thousands and thousands of people from Chicago lined up to go view Emmett's body. And his mother was criticized a lot for doing that. Why would you do that? Why would you have your son be viewed like that? And she had responded she wanted the world to know what these people in Mississippi had done to her son and received no punishment whatsoever. This would open the eyes of people around the country, and say that this needs to stop. There are people dying and not being punished for it. Now, one of the things that makes this even more disgusting is that later on, these two murderers and kidnappers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, would confess. And I think it was Look magazine. They described the night that they did murder Emmett Till, but because of the Fifth Amendment and the idea of double jeopardy, they've already been proven not guilty of this case, so they couldn't be punished. This is definitely something that is going to push the civil rights movement in the direction which we'll see happen in the 60s. Just a couple more things in this video before we wrap up. Now, remember, I said this is just part one of the civil rights movement. I'll be posting at least one, if not two more videos to go along with this. But one of the last things I wanted to talk to you guys about in this same era here in 1955 is something called the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, you guys have all probably heard of Rosa Parks before, okay? And it is at her hand that this will happen. She gets onto a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She's asked to give up her seat for a white citizen, and she refuses. She refuses to get out of her seat and move to the back because she was there before the white citizen, and she didn't think that there was any reason why she should. Now, what a lot of people think about Rosa Parks is a lot of people think that she was just some old lady who got on a bus and who had just had enough. Rosa Parks was very much a civil rights leader prior to this. She was very well trained and knew exactly what she was doing. And the word spreads through Montgomery and across the country. And African Americans and white Americans who are in favor of equal rights decided to boycott the public transportation system. Now, boycott means that you are going to refuse to pay for a service or use a service in order to prove a point. I want you to know that, to write that down. So what they're going to do is they are going to try to get all of the supporters to carpool, to ride bikes, to walk to work, and not use the public transportation system. That way, they will not make any money, and they will hopefully change the ways they do business. Um, One of the most important people besides Rosa Parks, who is going to organize this whole thing and kind of be the face of the Montgomery bus boycott, is a 26-year-old preacher or minister named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At age 26, he is organizing and is the face of the Montgomery bus boycott, which ends up being very successful. As you already know, Martin Luther King will become probably the biggest civil rights um, leader that the United States has ever seen, one of the biggest in the world. Um, and he was really successful because he practiced nonviolent protest. Okay, I'm not saying that he didn't agitate people or didn't, um, try to push the envelope a little bit, but he was very much in favor of nonviolent. So that would include things like protests, boycotts, sit-ins, which we'll get into later, um, and things like that. Because when the world would see these people peacefully protesting and being jailed or being beaten or anything like that, they would say, man, those people just got thrown in jail for holding a sign, or they just got beat up for sitting at a lunch counter. You do not look like the aggressor. You do not look like the problem. Um, and that is really the only form of protest in the United States that we're going to see that actually works for achieving civil rights. All right, guys. So, like I said, there's going to be more civil rights videos coming your way in the near future. But um, for this one, make sure you have these key takeaways. I need you to know that Harry Truman desegregated the military in '48. I need you to know the significance of Brown versus Board of Education. I need you to know the significance behind the murder of Emmett Till and why that was so important. I need you to know what the Montgomery bus boycott was, and who Rosa Parks and a young Martin Luther King Jr. Were. I also need you to be able to explain what nonviolent protesting is. Later on, I will have a comparison video between nonviolent and violent protesting. But just from what you heard from me and what you have in between the ears up here, you need to know that as well. So stay safe out there, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.